The kettle had just begun its low, insistent hum, a prelude to a scream, when she blew in with the frigid December wind. I didn't turn around. My hands, now knotted with the geography of 81 years, still remembered the familiar rhythm of this small kitchen. 2 porcelain cups on the worn oak table, 1 spoon, no sugar. I still set the table as if she were 7 and not 47, as if this house, steeped in the scent of lemon oil and old books, still meant something more to her than a line item in a will. As if she were still my daughter. She didn't offer a greeting, merely dropped a thick manila folder onto the table with the same careless grace she used to discard withered flowers. "Mother, sign these," she commanded, her voice as clipped and sterile as the surgical steel she wielded in her other life. Her coat was still on, a severe black cashmere thing that cost more than my monthly pension, its shoulders dusted with the frozen gravel from the driveway. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes, a perfect, unforgiving knot at the base of her skull. And those eyes? The same dark, fathomless eyes I had once gazed into as I held her tiny body, whispering away the monsters under her bed, now held nothing for me. No warmth, no memory, no regret. Only a chilling, impatient calculation. I reached for the reading glasses tethered by a silver chain around my neck and unfolded the documents. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. I knew what they were, but the stark, black and white finality of the text was still a blow. A full, irrevocable power of attorney. Complete, unilateral control of the trust. My trust. My husband Arthur's legacy. The carefully tended garden we had cultivated over a lifetime, intended to provide for our old age and for our family long after we were gone. There was no review clause, no shared access, no oversight. Just her, just Isabelle. "I don't understand," I said, my voice a fragile thread, though I understood with a horrifying clarity that was settling deep in my bones. "It's time," she replied, her tone flat, clinical, the one I imagined she used to deliver a terminal diagnosis. "You're not managing things well anymore. You forgot to pay the hydro bill twice last quarter. You've made errors at the bank. This is safer. For everyone." I looked at her face, a beautiful, cold mask, and searched for the girl I had raised. The girl who loved thunderstorms and the smell of cinnamon, who once cried for a week when her pet canary died. She was gone, replaced by this stranger who called me mother, as if it were a burdensome title she was forced to bear. "Your father and I, this isn't what we planned," I managed, my hands trembling slightly as I pushed the papers away. She scoffed. It wasn't a laugh, just a short, sharp exhalation of sound laced with a superiority that cut deeper than any shout. "Dad built that trust, Mother. You just watched it grow. Let's stop pretending you had any real part in its creation." Something ancient and hard rose in my chest, a dormant volcano of unspoken truths and swallowed sorrows. But I tamped it down. I had spent a lifetime tamping things down. "Sit down, Isabelle," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Have some tea. We'll talk about this." She didn't move. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a wad of crumpled $5 and $10 bills, and dropped them onto the table as if tipping a particularly slow waitress. Then, with a theatrical slowness, she picked up a glass from the sink, filled it halfway with cold tap water, and began dropping coins into it, one by one. Plink, plink, plink. The sound was an obscenity in the quiet kitchen. I watched, paralyzed by a mixture of confusion and dread. She held the glass up to the light, then walked toward me. Without a flicker of hesitation, she flung the entire contents, water, coins, and all, onto my chest. The shock of the frigid water made me gasp. A raw, involuntary sound torn from my lungs. The coins struck my chest and scattered across the floor with a metallic clatter, some rolling under the cast-iron legs of the old stove. My thin cotton blouse clung to my skin, instantly cold and heavy. The room, my sanctuary, suddenly smelled of copper and humiliation. "There," she hissed, her voice sharp and vicious. The clinical detachment shattered to reveal the raw ugliness beneath. That's what you're worth. A jar of loose change. That's all you've ever been. You want to play dumb about the trust? Fine. But know this. I've already spoken to the attorneys, the hospital, the court. If you don't give me every document, every key, you'll lose more than this house. I'll have you declared incompetent by the end of the month. Do you understand me? I didn't answer. My body was shaking, but my mind was eerily calm. I bent down slowly, my joints protesting, and picked up one of the coins. A tarnished quarter, the Queen's profile worn smooth. Funny thing about age, it may dull the nerves, but it sharpens the memory to a razor's edge. That quarter, cool and solid in my palm, reminded me of the winter of 1978, of the countless hours I'd spent darning socks and taking in sewing for neighbors, hoarding every spare coin in a chipped porcelain jar until I had enough to buy Isabelle a pair of new red boots, ones that weren't secondhand from the church donation bin. I remembered the look on her face, the pure, unadulterated joy. Where had that little girl gone? I held the coin tightly, my wet sleeve dripping a steady rhythmic tattoo onto the worn linoleum. You can keep your coins, I said quietly, rising to my full, though slightly stooped height. I looked directly into her eyes, no longer searching for my daughter, but seeing the stranger for exactly who she was. I kept something else. Something you've forgotten. Something she didn't even know existed. She froze, her carefully constructed composure faltering. For the first time that morning, a flicker of uncertainty, of fear, entered her eyes. What does that mean? But I didn't answer. I just looked at her, the way a mother does when she stops begging her child to see her and simply begins seeing the truth of them instead. She stood there for a moment, her fists clenched, then snatched the folder from the table and stormed out the front door. The wind that rushed in to fill the vacuum she left was bitter and achingly dry. The door slammed shut. Silence, heavy and profound, settled back into the house. I stood there for a long while, soaked to the bone, one hand resting on the back of a chair, one foot on a coin that did not belong to me. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I had seen this moment coming for a very long time, a slow-motion storm gathering on the horizon of my life. I just never expected it to feel this cold. I met Arthur Vance on a blustery Thursday in October of 1961. I was 19, working at a downtown fabric shop, saving every spare dollar to go back and finish my nursing diploma. He was 22, already halfway through medical school, with an intensity in his eyes that felt like a premonition. He came in looking for heavy wool for a winter coat, and I sold him a spool of thread he didn't need just to keep him talking for 5 more minutes. 2 months later, we were married in the back room of a small Methodist church with a bouquet of wilting lilies and 10 guests. I wore a borrowed dress and a veil that sat slightly askew. He wore a rented suit and an air of fierce, unshakable ambition. He promised me the world. Instead, I gave it to him. While he spent his nights hunched over thick medical textbooks, I spent mine stitching buttons onto other men's shirts and darning their socks to keep us afloat. I took every odd job no one else wanted: seamstress, night shift cleaner at the university library, short order cook at a greasy spoon diner. I learned to make a meal for 2 out of a can of beans and a bruised potato. I kept the lights on with pennies saved from skipped lunches. It was not a sacrifice. It was the quiet, unseen labor of love. Arthur became a surgeon, and a brilliant one at that. He was revered, respected, the kind of doctor that small-town hospitals in northern Vermont build their reputations on. He was also the kind of man who never came home before midnight. We moved into a proper house with a wide front porch and a garden I tilled with my own hands. I stopped working jobs with hourly wages and began the unpaid, unending work of keeping our home a sanctuary. Clean floors, hot meals on the table, well-ironed collars for his shirts. I raised our 2 children, Daniel and Isabelle, as if the entire future of civilization depended on how straight they stood and how kindly they spoke. Arthur loved me, I believe, but he loved being Dr. Vance more. At first, I excused the late-night calls from colleagues, the faint scent of a perfume that wasn't mine clinging to his coat. He was a doctor. People needed him. Patients were dying. I didn't realize that my own self-respect was slowly dying too. Then came the call I could not ignore. A woman. Her voice was young and sharp, not begging for my understanding but demanding my surrender. I confronted him that night, my heart a frantic bird in my chest. He did not lie, and somehow that hurt more than if he had. He told me it was over, that it had been meaningless. I believed him, not because he was convincing, but because I had 2 small children sleeping upstairs, a mortgage in his name, and no family to run back to. We did not speak of it again. Not once in 40 years. I forgave him, not for his sake or even for mine. I did it for Isabelle, who was 7, and for Daniel, who was 12. I did it for the illusion of safety, for the fragile stability of the world I had so painstakingly built. Because love, I had learned, does not always come wrapped in respect. Sometimes it comes bound in survival. Arthur changed eventually. He grew older, wearier. The ambition in his eyes was replaced by a deep-seated exhaustion. He came home earlier. He took up gardening, his surgeon's hand surprisingly gentle as he coaxed roses from the stubborn Vermont soil. He built Isabelle a dollhouse from scratch, painting it lavender and white, a miniature replica of our own home. I think, in his own silent, clumsy way, he was trying to atone for all the words he had never said, for the wounds he had inflicted and never acknowledged. Still, he played favorites. Daniel, our son, could do no wrong. He walked like his father, talked like him, carried himself with an easy confidence that Arthur adored. He gave Daniel his praise, his patience, his unconditional forgiveness. He gave Isabelle his expectations. She was brilliant, just like him, but he treated her brilliance not as a gift, but as a threat to his own legacy. Every mistake she made, he catalogued. Every success, he critiqued. She learned to work twice as hard for half the affection, her heart hardening into a perfect, polished stone of resentment. When Daniel died in a car accident at 26, something in Arthur broke. Something in all of us did. But what shattered in Isabelle was different. She never said it aloud, but I think a part of her always believed that her brother's death would finally clear the path to her father's approval. It did not. After the funeral, Arthur grew quieter, more distant. He kept a single one of Daniel's ties hanging in the back of his closet, a sacred relic no one was allowed to touch. With Isabelle, he remained formal, almost clinical, as if he could not find a version of her that didn't remind him of what he had lost, or perhaps what he had always ignored. I tried to be the bridge between them, a thankless, impossible task. But years of silence can turn into a wall of stone, and Arthur had a talent for masonry. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, he refused treatment. He said he was tired of cutting into other people's bodies and would not let anyone cut into his. We had 12 months. Some were good, most were quiet. One night, near the end, I sat beside him in his reading chair in the den. The fire had burned down to embers. I thought he was asleep when he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. If she ever turns into me, Nora. If she ever loses sight of what truly matters, don't give her everything. Keep something for yourself. Protect yourself. Do not trust blood more than you trust your own instincts. He was talking about Isabelle. He was talking about himself. The next day, he called Marcus Thorne, an old friend from his army days, a lawyer from Boston, a man I had never known him to trust with anything besides a shared bottle of scotch. They met in private for hours. I did not ask questions. When Arthur passed, Marcus delivered a sealed envelope containing a small, ornate key and a single, simple instruction. Use this only if you feel the walls closing in. I tucked it away in my old family Bible, between the stoicism of Psalms and the wisdom of Proverbs. I prayed I would never need it. I should have known better. Because Isabelle was her father's daughter. She had inherited his brilliance, his pride, and, as I would soon find out, his devastating capacity to wound the ones who loved her most. The unraveling began at the grocery store. I was standing at the checkout, trying to pay for milk, bread, and a small bunch of daffodils, when my debit card was declined. The young man at the register offered a polite, practiced smile, but I saw the quick, pitying glance he gave the customer behind me. That look, poor old woman, slips out before people can censor it. I stepped aside, my face burning with a shame I didn't understand, and fumbled through my handbag for a dusty emergency credit card. It worked, barely, but something felt deeply wrong. When I got home, I tried logging into my online banking portal. The page wouldn't load. I called the bank. After 45 minutes on hold, listening to a tinny rendition of a Vivaldi concerto, a woman with a voice too chipper for bad news informed me that my access had been restricted due to an updated guardianship status. I didn't understand the term. "Ma'am," she said, her condescension thinly veiled by politeness, "it shows here that your financial authority has been legally transferred. Do you have paperwork from a court-appointed representative?" I froze, the receiver suddenly cold against my ear. "No," I said. "There's no guardian. This is my account. I've had it for over 50 years. "I'm sorry," she said gently, as if speaking to a confused child. "But according to our system, that is no longer the case." There was a pause, filled with the sound of her tapping keys. "Is there someone else in the household who manages your affairs? A daughter, perhaps?" My heart sank like a stone in a deep, cold well. A month earlier, Isabelle had visited after a routine doctor's appointment. Her tone had been unusually warm, her concerns seemingly genuine. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one where she would later throw cold water and coins, and said, "Mother, would it be all right if I helped you with some of the paperwork? The medical bills are so complicated. It would save you so much stress." It had sounded reasonable. She was a doctor, after all. She knew about insurance codes and billing loopholes. She asked for my online banking login, just in case, and like a fool, I gave it to her. Now I was locked out of my own life. I called her that night. She picked up on the second ring, her voice calm, distracted. I could hear the clinking of ice in a glass, the low murmur of music in the background. "Hello, Mother." I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Why can't I access my bank accounts, Isabelle?" A pause, just a beat too long. "You must be confused. We talked about this, remember?" "No, we didn't. Not about transferring authority, not about guardianship." Another pause. "You're probably just mixing things up. You've been forgetting a lot lately. You told me last week you couldn't remember what day it was. This is why I stepped in. It's safer this way." "I'm not confused, Isabelle. I'm angry. Did you file legal paperwork without telling me?" "I did what was necessary," she said, her tone turning to steel. "You left the oven on last week, didn't you? Burned a pot of soup until the smoke alarm went off. What if it had been worse? One burned pot doesn't make me incompetent. It's not just the pot. It's everything. It's you refusing help. It's you acting like money you didn't even earn is somehow yours to mismanage. That stopped me cold. It was your father's money," she continued, her voice dripping with a lifetime of resentment. "You were just there. You signed the papers, but he earned it. It should have gone to me a long time ago." "I was his wife," I whispered. She sighed, a long, weary sound, as though my very existence exhausted her. "I don't want to argue about this. It's done. Go to bed and rest. I'll handle everything from now on." She hung up before I could speak again. I stood in the hallway for a long time, the dial tone buzzing in my ear like a trapped wasp I couldn't swat away. The next day, I went to the bank in person. I wore my best coat and pinned on the silver brooch Arthur had given me on our 30th anniversary. I stood as tall as I could, a woman who still belonged in the world. The teller looked at my ID, tapped her keyboard, then frowned. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance. You've been flagged as a restricted account holder. We can't give you access without written permission from your legal guardian." "I am not under guardianship," I said firmly. She turned the monitor toward me, her expression a mixture of pity and protocol. There was my name, and next to it a bold red banner, Financial Protection Statute, Acting Guardian, Dr. Isabelle Vance. I did not cry, not there. I thanked her, left the bank, and walked 3 blocks before my knees gave out, and I had to sit on a bench outside a pharmacy. The November cold seeped in through the thin soles of my shoes. I watched the world pass by. Young mothers with strollers, teenagers with headphones, couples holding hands. The world had moved on, and I had been left behind. When I returned home, Mrs. Gable from next door was walking her little terrier. "Nora," she waved. "I saw your daughter's name in the paper's business section," she said cheerfully. "She's listed on that new property development down in the Carolinas. A resort, I think. Grand opening in the spring. Looks very fancy." I blinked. "My daughter lives in Boston. She's a surgeon." "Oh no, dear," she said, digging into her coat pocket for her phone. "It was in the announcements. She's listed as a primary investor. They're calling it the Serenity Key. Isn't that a lovely name?" I nodded slowly, but I felt like the earth had tilted beneath my feet. A resort. With what money? My money. Arthur's money. The puzzle pieces snapped together, each one sharp and jagged. She had used the fraudulent guardianship to redirect the trust funds. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table where everything seemed to happen now, betrayals, bargains, quiet revelations, and I stared at my hands. Was I losing my memory? Had I missed signs? Was I, in fact, slipping? That was the cruelest part of her plan. The seed of doubt she had planted in my mind was sprouting thick, choking vines, winding around every memory like a noose. I opened the drawer where I kept my Bible. I slid my fingers between the pages. The key was still there, cool, heavy, untouched. I held it in my palm and whispered aloud to the empty house. Not yet, but I knew. Soon. The office was in a new glass and steel tower downtown, the kind of place that smelled of freshly printed money and filtered air. Everything about it felt cold and important. I wore my best coat, the green wool one Arthur had liked. Isabelle said it made me look old-fashioned, but I wore it anyway. I wanted to feel like I still belonged to myself. Inside, a man in a gray suit with a smile that didn't reach his eyes greeted us. He looked to be Isabelle's age, too young to have any wisdom, but old enough to have learned how to fake it. "This is Mrs. Vance," Isabelle said, putting a proprietary hand on my back, as if I were a piece of antique furniture she was having appraised. "She's ready to finalize the estate transition we discussed." I blinked. "I am?" I said quietly. The man gestured to a long conference table. A thick stack of papers sat waiting, a pen already uncapped beside them. "Just a few signatures," he said smoothly. "This is a simple restatement of your will and trust. Consolidates everything under Dr. Vance's administration. Streamlined, efficient." I sat down slowly. My hands were shaking, and not from age. I flipped through the first few pages, the dense legal jargon wrapping around numbers like barbed wire. Isabelle leaned over, tapping the signature lines with a perfectly manicured finger. "You don't need to read all that, Mother. It's standard. We went over most of it last month, remember?" "We didn't," I said, my voice small but steady. I looked at the top of the page. It listed a full asset transfer to Isabelle Ann Vance, with an immediate forfeit of Nora Elizabeth Vance's fiduciary control, irrevocable. My heart hammered against my ribs. "I'm not signing this." Isabelle stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. Her face transformed. The cool composure vanished, replaced by a fury that was shocking in its intensity. "You don't get to do this," she hissed. "You've already caused enough trouble." I rose to leave, but she blocked the door. "You are not leaving here without signing." I looked at the man in the gray suit. "Are you her attorney?" He didn't answer, merely adjusted his tie. I turned back to Isabelle. "Is he even licensed?" That's when she snapped. She lunged toward me, grabbed my arm, and yanked hard. The seam of my old coat tore open with a sound that was sharp and final. "You're a burden," she shouted, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of coffee and rage. "You've always been a burden, a leftover. You think that money is yours? You think your pie recipes and your stupid journals mean something? They don't. You're an old woman clinging to things you didn't build." Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not in front of her. "If you don't sign," she said, her voice dropping to a panting whisper, "you are not my mother anymore. Do you hear me? You're no one? Nothing." Then she picked up her phone. She dialed quickly, her voice instantly shifting into that calm, fake sweetness she used with patients. "Yes, hello. This is Dr. Isabelle Vance. I'm here with my elderly mother, and I'm very concerned. She's confused, agitated. She's showing signs of paranoia. I'm afraid she might hurt herself. Or someone else." I stared at her, stunned into silence. "No, she's not violent," Isabelle continued, looking me straight in the eye, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "But she's been declining rapidly. She shouldn't be living alone." 15 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived. One was kind, the other was not. They asked me questions as if I were already guilty. Did I know where I was, what year it was? I answered calmly, my mind a small, clear island in a sea of chaos. But when they asked about the trust and I explained that my daughter had tried to force me to sign it over, they exchanged a look. The unkind one said, "Let's just take her in for observation. Better safe than sorry." I was escorted out of the building like a criminal. People stared. I wanted to scream, to tell them what was happening, but my throat was closed tight with a grief too vast for words. They put me in the back of a squad car and took me to a facility 20 miles away. It wasn't a hospital. It was a place with gray walls, locked doors, and a nurse who called me sweetheart but never looked me in the eye. I spent 48 hours in evaluation. They gave me bland food on a plastic tray and watched me take my pills. A psychiatrist with tired eyes asked me if I had ever been suicidal. I said no. He asked if I trusted my daughter. I said, "Not anymore." He scribbled something I couldn't see on his clipboard. When I was finally released, deemed cognitively sound but suffering from situational stress, I returned home in a taxi, alone. The key still worked in the front door. The light still turned on. But something fundamental had shifted. My daughter had tried to erase me. Not just from the bank, not just from the law, but from my own life. She had said it herself. "If you do not sign, you are not my mother." And I hadn't signed. So I wasn't. Not to her. But I still had one thing left. The key. And now, I was finally ready to use it. The courtroom was small and overheated. Every seat was filled. A young woman from the Boston Globe sat in the back, her notepad balanced on her knee. A local news crew was there too. A single, discreet camera. I saw Isabelle flinch when its small red recording light came on. She wore an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, her hair in that same tight knot, a fortress of control. Her face was powdered, but it couldn't hide the tension around her mouth. I wore a simple gray dress, no makeup, just the silver brooch Arthur had given me. In my hands, I clutched my old family Bible. The judge was a woman with kind eyes and a methodical mind. She listened patiently as Marcus Langford, his voice rough with age but firm with conviction, presented the case. He played the recording first. The courtroom fell silent, the only sound Arthur's voice, steady and unflinching from the grave. "If my daughter becomes the man I once was, let this money serve justice, not genetics." Isabelle didn't move, didn't even blink. But I saw the betraying twitch in her jaw. Then came the documents Marcus had retrieved from the safe deposit box, the secret addendum to the trust, signed, witnessed, sealed for over a decade. Proof that Arthur had foreseen this very betrayal and had, in his own final, flawed act of love, chosen to protect me. Next, the bank records, a clear, damning trail of transfers totaling over $2 million into offshore accounts linked to the Serenity Key development. And finally, the psychiatric report from the facility stating clearly, no signs of dementia. Subject demonstrates full cognitive clarity. I was not losing my mind. Isabelle was losing her mask. When her attorney stood, he barely lasted 5 minutes. All he could offer was spin, concern for my well-being, a family misunderstanding. The judge didn't even look at him. She turned to Isabelle. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Dr. Vance?" Isabelle stood. For the first time, she looked small, her expensive suit hanging on her like a costume. "I was trying to help my mother," she said, her voice thin. "She wasn't coping. She's never been good with money. I thought I was protecting the family legacy." I met her eyes across the courtroom. She couldn't hold my gaze. The judge nodded once, then she spoke, her voice ringing with authority. "In my courtroom, guardianship is not a tool for theft. Dr. Vance, you abused your legal access and your mother's trust, both literally and figuratively. You will be removed as guardian effective immediately. As of this moment, you are stripped of any and all rights to the Vance Trust, and this court will be forwarding its findings to the medical board for immediate review." A gasp rippled through the room. I exhaled, a breath I felt I'd been holding for a lifetime. It wasn't a feeling of victory, but of release. The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Vance, you are hereby reinstated as the sole trustee and beneficiary of your late husband's estate. I hope you find peace in knowing the system, at least today, worked." 3 months later, I stood in front of a modest brick building with a new sign above the door. The Nora House, a haven for mothers remembered. It used to be a private care facility. I had once applied there for a volunteer position, years ago. They had turned me down. Now I owned the land. I had used a portion of the trust to turn the building into a community center for elderly women who had been discarded, dismissed, or silenced. We offered free legal aid, cooking classes, and art therapy. I came in every Wednesday and taught a class on how to bake apple pie from scratch. I always brought the cinnamon. The article in the Globe went viral. The headline read, "Surgeon Disinherits Mother, Gets Disinherited by Ghost. How a Grandmother's Love Built Justice from Scratch. Isabelle Lost Her Medical License." The Serenity Key Resort filed for bankruptcy before it ever opened. She called me once, left a voicemail. "I hope you're happy," she said, her voice hollow. "You've ruined everything." I never called back. She was wrong. I hadn't ruined anything. I had just stopped pretending silence was loyalty. The ribbon across the entrance of the newly finished front porch was pale blue. The porch was wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and a lifetime of Sunday conversations. I sat in the front row at the dedication ceremony, not in the back, not by the kitchen, front and center, with my name on the program and my granddaughter's hand in mine. Lily had come to see me after the court case. She didn't speak about her mother, and I didn't ask. But today she leaned close and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Grandma." It was the first time anyone had said that to me. A woman from the local radio station introduced me. She called me a founder, a visionary, a protector of the forgotten. Words that once would have made me laugh. Now, I held them in my chest like warmth. I stood up slowly, walked to the podium, and unfolded not a speech, but a letter. "Dear Isabelle," I read aloud. A hush fell over the courtyard. "You once said I didn't earn that money. And maybe, in some ways, you were right. The money began with him. But the life, it began with me. You mistook my stillness for weakness. My patience, you called it nothing, but it built everything you ever had. I looked at the people before me, women in wheelchairs, women holding rosaries, women with hands like mine, wrinkled, worn, but still strong. I finished. I do not need to be called mother anymore, but I will never stop being one, not just to the daughter who forgot, but to every woman here who needs someone to remember." Later, they unveiled the plaque outside the reading room. It said, "The Nora Vance Library for Quiet Women Who Remember Everything." Last week, a young nurse at the center asked me, "Do you feel like you finally got justice?" I smiled. "No, sweetheart," I said. "I got something better." She tilted her head. "I got my life back." And for the first time since I was 19, I didn't feel like I was just keeping house for someone else. I was home. And it was mine.